Hello, welcome to the inaugural session of a mini-course I like to call The Quest of the Historical Moses. I'm your instructor, Robert M. Price, and this is brought to you by the Institute for Higher Critical Studies. As you know from the Bible Geek and the Gospel of Thomas series and so forth, I tend to be mainly a New Testament man, but I really love the Old Testament as well, and I've taught it for many years, and I'd like to take a dip into that for our purposes today. Let me start out with a source-critical question. As anybody knows, we've got really sort of in the same way in the New Testament with the Gospels, there are four of them that form our main source of information about Jesus. Well, you got the same sort of thing in the Old Testament. You've got four books, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which tell a continuous story, or so it seems, of Moses, the great lawgiver, but you can divide these up, and if you want to toss in Genesis, in which, of course, Moses does not yet appear as a character, you can divide the Pentateuch, that is the first five books, the Torah proper, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, into four great blocks of source material, that is, four prior documents that overlap one another, and they have been made into one long and repetitive narrative. In fact, the same thing exactly happened in the case of the Gospels, when in the 2nd century someone, we usually think Tatian, a disciple of Justin Martyr, over in Syria, decided to weave the four canonical Gospels into one mega-gospel, one super-gospel, which we call the diatessaron, which means one via four, literally through the four. You get this one massive gospel. Well, that's just what happened with the Pentateuch. There were four sources that were put together, and we don't have the sources, any copies of them anymore, but it really doesn't matter. The arguments are so persuasive that I doubt if scholarship's ever really going to move from this. There are a few people that nowadays don't buy it and have other theories, but either they're not qualitatively different, that is, they're just variations on the theme and somewhat just revisions of it, or they tend to me to be implausible. And so what are the four sources that most scholars would agree on that underlie the text? Well, they are, the first is the so-called J source, the so-called because I wish we could say Y source, because this was cooked up by German scholars who pronounce J's as we do in English Y's. But, we're kind of stuck with it. So they called it the J source because throughout this source, this epic, as I like to call it, refers to God as Yahweh, with very rare exceptions for obvious reasons here and there. And Yahweh, or Jehovah if you prefer, which is a less accurate attempt at rendering the same Hebrew. Now, let's see, so that's one reason for the J, Jehovah or Yahweh. But the other is that the most of the places where things happen are in the south of Israel, namely the territory of Judah, or Yehuda, and hence handy mnemonic device, we call it J, because most of it takes place in Judah, and they call God Jehovah or Yahweh. Traditionally, Wellhausen and others dated this source to something like 1000 BCE. It would have been gathered and compiled and written down in the time of Solomon and or his son Rehoboam. This was a time when we, as we read it in the Bible anyway, there was a great attempt to consolidate power and to create a spectacular royal city in Jerusalem with a great Davidic palace and the great temple of Jerusalem. It's at a time like this that there would have been funds expended on an endeavor like this which has to be pictured as something like sending out the Brothers Grimm into Germany to gather all the old folk tales and nursery rhymes from the various people that repeated them before. Modernization being what it is, we lost all of those, and so just as the Brothers Grimm copied all these things down in their variant versions and so forth, as good ethnographers, so did the J writer, whoever he was, and nobody's ever had a name for him. He went around to all the holy places in Judah and gathered stories told by the priests and the people there, very often stories about the holy places and why they were holy, because each had a competing story to tell, that Yahweh had appeared there to Abraham or Isaac or Jacob or Moses or whatever, and therefore this is where you ought to go to do your praying and get an oracle from God about your future. So there were a lot of these, and many of them were the so-called high places, hilltop shrines that King Josiah would later on close down. So what are the parameters of this J source? Well, its story begins with the creation, the Garden of Eden story. And then it at least goes through the time of Moses and Aaron, and then there's some debates as to whether we find J material also in some of the other latter prophets, so-called history books. But for our purposes, we'll just say it goes from the creation of man in Eden all the way through Moses. The characteristics of J include the lively mythological sense that God is sometimes directly present on earth among human beings, just as Zeus is in Greek myths. He comes and closes the door for Noah on the ark. He shows up in person at Abraham's campfire and so forth. Also, the human characters in the stories are shown, warts and all, to entertain as well as to edify. They're not yet plaster saints in many cases. Abraham is shown as a hen-pecked husband, Jacob as a resourceful rogue, and so forth. They tend to get a little gussied up in later versions of the same stories. There are underlying types of stories, as Hermann Gunkel pointed out to great effect in his commentary on Genesis, and they occur in Exodus too, though, and all throughout the Pentateuch. There are various types of tales that were told to satisfy curiosity or to legitimize social and religious institutions. And because you wanted to tie them down, give them a pedigree in the lives of the patriarchs and Moses and so forth, so that it wasn't just somebody's idea, which it undoubtedly was, almost any rule you can think of, but no, you wanted to attribute it to the big guys, the great heroes. And as we go on into this, we will examine the 5 major kinds of legends or myths that are now written down in the Pentateuch, but they include etymological myths, where the story is told to explain or re-explain a name. Either people have forgotten what it meant and have used their imaginations, as when in our country people say that the name Connecticut comes from the Connecticut River. But why should it be named that? Well, because it connects 2 states as the boundary between them, and cuts 2 more states by running down the middle of them. Well, that's pretty clever, but it's not why Connecticut is an Indian name, of course. But somebody didn't know that, and they used their very clever imagination to come up with a re-explanation. Or in England, there's a street called Rotten Row, and they figure, well, that must be one hell of a slum, well, as it may have become, but actually it goes back to Norman French and means route en roi, the pathway of the king. and these things suffer in transmission. And there's a lot of this in the Old Testament, and sometimes it's because they knew darn well what a name meant, the name of a person or a place, but it had what were later thought to be pagan associations that were no longer kosher, and so they had to be re-explained. There are loads of those, as I say. Well, there are also a lot of ceremonial stories, precedents for dietary laws, festivals, etc., and why we don't eat the muscle that is in the hollow of the thigh, and so on, or why a certain ritual dance of a certain kind is done at this particular place, and why we don't have infant sacrifice anymore, and so on and so on and so on. Then there are geological myths where you just want to explain some strange phenomena that everybody sees and is commented on. And, of course, the one that should be leaping to mind with you right now is Mrs. Lot, the prototype for the Morton salt label. Where did this come from? Well, anybody knows if they just think about it. Somebody saw a wind-eroded pillar of rock salt, and there have been many over the years, probably a bunch of them over there right now, in the Dead Sea Valley. And it roughly, especially from a distance, had the contours of a human figure, specifically a woman, and so it must have been one. There's similar Arabic stories about how an outcropping of rock from a distance looks like a bunch of gazelles frozen in place as they ran. Well, it must have been that. And so great was the beauty that Allah decided to preserve it for all time to come by petrifying it. That's pretty good. That's kind of a nice story, but that's all it is. There's no great theological point to be made. In a sense, this is demythologizing and that you're kind of cracking a code, but not in the sense Bultmann talks about, not in the sense that there's some great statement made here about human existence. You just have to face it sooner or later that not everything in the Bible is all that important, but it is mighty interesting. There are ethnological myths, stories that are in effect political cartoons that symbolize groups, nations, tribes, etc. in the time of the storyteller by reference to imaginary ancestors of theirs, progenitors, usually, but not always, eponymous ancestors. That is, the progenitor will have the same name as the whole nation. Sometimes not. That's not a constant, but they will tell you who is supposed to be descended from Esau, etc., etc. And the stories about how these ancient people, these patriarchs of various groups interacted, symbolizes the way the nations had always interacted at the time of the storyteller. And if this changes, we may have a later storyteller tell a different tale, or a later editor rewrite the story. But it's a way of saying, well, what do you want? No wonder we can't get along with so-and-so tribe over there. Our first ancestors feuded, and I guess it's just in the blood. It's always going to be that way. You just listen to the evening news about Israel and Palestine, you can see why that's an attractive way of looking at it. And then there are, I guess my favorite, the etiological stories. We don't use that word much outside of medicine, and we ask, what is the etiology of your ailment? What's ailing you? Well, you know the symptoms, but the clever doctor determines the underlying cause, or etiology. And so the word used to be used in a wider sense, and that's where Gunkel got it. And for him, etiological myths are, you might say, pre-scientific, quasi-scientific explanations by ingenious people who had no scientific technology of observation. And so they just couldn't resist trying to explain where the rainbow came from and what it was. Well, There's no way these people are going to know about the refraction of light and all that stuff. They're not stupid, but there's no way they could have known that, given their lack of technology. So they put their brains to work in a different way and said, we worship a storm god, Yahweh. The lightnings must be the arrows he shoots. He's a warrior, so he must have a bow to shoot them from, and that's got to be the one I see in the sky over there. I mean, it's giant. He's a giant. That must be what he used to shoot those lightning arrows out with during the storm, and now that the storm is over, he has hung up the bow. The battle is ended. He must have won. And there are such stories in all cultures. For instance, you ever wonder why spiders are called arachnids? Well, they're named for Arachne, a kind of a big mouth woman who was a great seamstress in ancient Greece and could do such amazing handiwork that she began to brag about being better at it even than Athena. What a mistake. Well, so they had a kind of Charlie Daniels band showdown between Athena and little mortal Arachne. And the surprising thing was Arachne won, but she made the mistake of gloating over it, and you can't really do that with a god and get away with it. So Athena changed her into a spider and said, well, now you're going to have the time to spin all you want. And that explains why arachnids spin webs. Pretty good, huh? Now, that doesn't really tell us why, right? But how were the ancient Greeks to know that? They weren't stupid for telling a story like that. They're quite ingenious. It's just that explanations take on a whole different form once you get scientific research methods and observational technologies that these smart people did not have. So you will not find me dismissing the storytellers of the Bible as ignorant buffoons. Ignorant, yes, in a way, in that they simply did not have the advantage of the kind of knowledge that their own ingenuity and that of their descendants would one day lead. But, at the time, you just have to marvel at the ingenuity of what they did come up with. Well, all right. So the Pentateuch is filled with these stories. Almost every narrative, virtually every narrative, I'm going to get to a few exceptions in a moment, is one of these types of myth, and they are all myths. People used to try to say during the time of William Foxwell Albright, a Presbyterian layman, apologist who used archaeology to back up the Bible and did a lot of work that is rejected today. People used to say that, oh yeah, the stories of Abraham fit what we know of ancient Canaan, and Moses must have existed, and King David and King Solomon. Well, archaeology in our day has pretty much destroyed all that. The Old Testament, really, and a lot of the New Testament are kind of in the same leaky boat with the Book of Mormon. There really is no decent reason to believe that any of this stuff happened. Now, I tell you, for my critical approach, a loyal son of Bultmann and the gang, I was taken aback to learn how far Old Testament minimalists would go, showing that there just isn't any evidence for an Exodus ever having occurred. And that doesn't mean they just haven't found it. It could only have taken place in a pretty small area. I don't care what route you choose as that of the Exodus. I know there have been at least 3. I don't care what range of dates you pick. Some people think it was 1250 BCE, others 1400. Doesn't matter. Throw in the whole range of space and time there just isn't any evidence for a population move like this. And there would have to be evidence. I mean, they think they found the old city of Irem mentioned in the Quran. Well, I'm not sure if they've got the right place or not, but they found some ancient city, and the way they did it was by using infrared technology from the air, and you could pick up invisible trade routes where camels and their caravans had stomped the ground again and again. I mean, you can pick that up. But there is no archaeological evidence for an exodus, and unless you think God, perversely wanting to test our faith, sent down a bunch of angels with vacuum cleaners to get rid of all of it, it just means the story didn't happen. And some had suspected that, but I think the nail in the coffin came when archaeology could never find anything. And similarly, there is zero evidence of some sort of a Israelite conquest of Canaan. That doesn't mean there are no artifacts of the people we know of as Israelites in Canaan, but there does not appear to have been a conquest. In fact, it's not clear that they were even outsiders moving in. It appears now that the ancient Israelites were simply one more group of Canaanite Semites. They were just kissing cousins with the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, etc. And did they overcome the other ones? Well, apparently they did at certain points. It's not clear whether it's Joshua or David who did it, but then again, it's not clear whether these are even historical individuals anymore. And I used to think surely Saul, Solomon, and David are where biblical narrative enters history. There were some legends about them, but I figure, well, surely, though, we're dealing with real people here. Well, biblical minimalism and its accompanying archaeology have made me doubt that pretty darn seriously. Seems like just all of it may be myth and legend. And I'll explain some reasons for this later, but I rather imagine Moses was originally a sun god and there was never a historical Moses. But we do want to deal in detail with what the Pentateuch tells us about the Moses character and his exploits, and we will find, even without benefit of archaeology, not that there isn't any relevant archaeology, I'm just not an archaeologist, we're going to find from a simple literary analysis we just don't have any biographical information about Moses. And I think you'll enjoy the ride on this one. So I need to get back to the sources. Because all of them, let's say J and the second one, E, which I want to get to in a moment, and to a limited degree P, are dependent on these collected oral traditions. But there are different sources because different people went out to do the collecting in different places. So let's get to the second one. The E source is called that because it usually refers to God as El or Elohim, which is technically plural, and it calls God that until a strategic scene where God confronts Moses and says, right before the Exodus, and says, all right, I've been known by other names before, but from now on I am to be known as Yahweh. That is my name forever. And so it gets a little more confusing after that. You can pick out E before that in the Pentateuch because only the E name is used for God. But after that encounter with God, then you have to rely on these other characteristics, but they're clear enough. Another reason the source is called E is that it is located primarily up north in the part of Israel called Ephraim. And so that's handy again, Ephraim, and which is the northern 10 tribes. And God is called Elohim in it. This seems to come on the traditional dating from about 150 years later than J. That'd be around 850. Now, why is that? Well, because it seems to think of prophets as the central category for a biblical patriarch. Abraham is called a prophet. Now, that he doesn't really fit the category of what we usually think of when we think of prophets, but it implies that was the category for a religious hero at that time, and so they threw him in with them. Well, why would they? Well, being a prophet was sort of a new thing. That would be around the time of Elijah and Elisha, the miracle-working prophets of the Deuteronomic history. Would fit Hosea, Amos, and people like that. The first Isaiah of Jerusalem. So prophets would appear to have been a new big wave, and so they gratuitously call Abraham a prophet. Like, if Abraham actually functioned as a prophet, to call him one would not help us date it. The fact that he doesn't quite fit implies that the term had just come into prominence, and so I figured, well, let's give him the honor. So, anyway, this would be, again, up north once Israel and Judah split up during the reign of Solomon's son Rehoboam, when the north abandoned the dynasty of David as a bunch of oppressors and declared independence up there. And what about the tenor of these stories? Well, they tend to be less colorful and poetic than the J stories, but only by a little. And God does not appear on stage as he does sometimes in the J stories. This implies they come from a later, somewhat more sophisticated time. They have God speak in a voice from heaven, off stage, that is, and they have him speak through dreams and oracles, a little bit more like people in the time in which he was written would expect to hear from God in dreams. They no longer expect that God would just show up at the door. I mean, Jehovah's Witnesses was one thing, but Jehovah himself was another. And as far as their characters are concerned, now they're a little bit uneasy with showing them in a bad light. And so some of the same stories we found in J that show the patriarchs in a questionable aspect don't show them that way anymore. Their motives and their actions are cleaned up a bit, and they're more saintly. And so that kind of attests a later stage in the evolution of the thing. This one starts not at the creation, but with Abraham. The only world they were really concerned about was the promised land. And so the issue is, how did our people get the deed to the promised land? Well, that had to do with Father Abraham. So they weren't that concerned with how the whole world started. But they do go on through Moses. It kind of goes on alongside of J, parallel to it, and the two do share some stories. And whoever united J and E had the choice of different versions of, let's say, Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. A big story there. Well, they didn't cut either one of them out. They just separated them with some other stories, and kind of hope you wouldn't notice. There's a few cases like that. Where did the covenant of circumcision come from? You got a couple of versions of it, and so on. And, let's see. I suppose that's good enough for E for the moment. Then you've got the priestly version, the P text. This was largely a huge bunch of laws. This was compiled during the Babylonian exile. Let's see. It was written by the priests, who, of course, were the most educated people, and they were taken off. The priests, the aristocrats, the king, and so forth, were taken off into Babylon by really just resettled. They weren't imprisoned or anything. They were resettled in Babylon by their conquerors. And they were given a great deal of freedom there and lived there pretty well. In fact, 50 years later, when those who were kids at the time, being older now, were allowed to go back, and their descendants, most of them didn't. So why bother? I kind of like it here in Babylon. Well, however, there was the problem of assimilation. There was the problem, are our kids going to even know what the Israelite faith is all about? Are they going to just adopt Babylonian ways? And of course, there's a lot of commonality between Israelite and Babylonian belief anyway, so It was a real threat, and so they decided, especially the laws having to do with sacrifice, etc. Since we cannot actually obey them, because by that time the custom down in Judea was that you could only offer sacrifice in the temple in Jerusalem. Well, they just couldn't do it anywhere else, and so they were afraid everything would be lost, and so they figured they'd darn well better write up something sort of like Plato's Republic, an outline of the way the Israelite Commonwealth ought to operate, and so they codified all kinds of ancient sacred laws from different sources, and they even gobbled up an earlier law code from earlier in the Babylonian exile called the Priestly Code, which is something like, I forget now, but I think it's chapters 17 through 26 of Leviticus. And they put together a lot of these things. Around the same time, Ezekiel, who was a priest taken away in the exile, he came up with his own law code that was published under his own name and not put into the Pentateuch for who knows what reason. But there were a number of attempts to preserve and codify Jewish law, and so the priests decided they needed a narrative lead-in to the code, and so they have a creation story started out with, and this is the famous Genesis 1 7-day creation account, and the priestly interest in it is pretty clear, and it's a good illustration of their signature trademarks. There's a repetitiveness. The priestly writer is just goes overboard, repeating himself redundantly again and again. A great love of statistics and details and numbers. A great love of systematizing and categorizing everything. There is the favorite phrase, these are the generations of so-and-so, the heavens and the earth, Abraham, Adam, whoever you're talking about, the major characters will have the generations of. And so genealogies are real big. I mean, P is not the only source with them, but the priestly source loves them. They will keep all these numbers and say, now so-and-so was so many years old when he had children, he had this many children, and he lived this many years after that time, and then he died. And all these statistics, the priests are the ones that kept that kind of statistics. They had to, because there were certain requirements for offerings and things, and so you had to keep records. So they have a creation account, and interestingly, it is divided into 6 days of work and a Sabbath, because they're trying to teach people the lesson that you ought to do that. You ought to work for 6 days and kick back on the Sabbath. And there is a long, detailed flood story for some reason. And I suppose that is because that's another legal landmark kind of thing. It marks the departure from a vegetarian diet to a meat-eating diet and so on. But most of the priestly narrative is just short summary. In fact, when you disentangle J, E, and P's narratives, which you can easily do, even once you're familiar enough with them in English, you can do this. And we will be doing it. You can see, most of the priestly narrative was simple summary. It hardly mentions any of the juicy details or any real anecdotes. It runs parallel with J and E, but it doesn't go into any great detail until it gets to Moses, and then you start having more definite and detailed legal precedents and so on. The fourth, yes, I should tell you. So when does it begin and end? Begins with the 7-day creation. Does not include the Garden of Eden, that's J. But it goes all the way through Moses and Aaron. Aaron is almost the priestly code's favorite character, because he was the great priest. And what about the names of God? It loves to call God, or the writer, loves to call him El Shaddai, which we think means something like God Almighty. That's the way it's usually translated. It's not absolutely clear, but that's probably the best guess. El Shaddai. Sometimes just calls him Elohim or El, which makes it a little tough to tell the difference between E and P. But it calls God any E name only until its version of the story, where Moses encounters God and God tells him, from now on, have him call me Yahweh or Jehovah. But even after that, when we've got the names overlapping between J, E, and P, the literary styles and the theological trademarks are so clear you can virtually always tell who you're reading. Now, the fourth source is Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is in broad outline like the priestly source, and actually it was compiled before P was, to tell you the truth, but it gets a little bit tricky. Somebody first wrote what we call Deuteronomy chapters 4 onward till the end, with the death of Moses. And it's mainly laws, though there's some hints back to when you were in Egypt, etc. But then someone figured it needed a historical prologue, just as the priestly source did. So what they do, they went and summarized J and E, which somebody had already woven together by that time being the 7th century BCE, in the time of King Josiah. And this is the book that was supposedly discovered when they were renovating the temple in Josiah's day. And the discovery of it made them shake in their boots, because they figured, oh my gosh, if this is what God had told us to do or be punished, we never heard of this stuff. We haven't been doing it. I guess we're in for it. And Deuteronomy had been composed by prophets and priests as a platform for reform, and then palmed off as an ancient document, much like the Book of Mormon. And so someone by this time had already unified J and E, and so someone decided to summarize J-E as the first 3 chapters of our Book of Deuteronomy. It's very interesting corroborative evidence, because there's no priestly narrative material in it. The stuff summarized at the beginning of Deuteronomy only parallels J and E. So that tells us something, right? J and E had been put together. But the priestly source had not yet been introduced. Now, Richard Elliott Friedman, in his book Who Wrote the Bible, takes the position that Deuteronomy was the last of the 4, and I've done it in that order, but I'd follow Wellhausen that P was the last. But it fundamentally doesn't matter for the kind of thing we're doing here. But one thing that probably leads to his theory is that you can find Deuteronomic redaction, that is editorial tampering with material from J, E, and P. So that makes you wonder if Deuteronomy itself is not later. I don't think it is, but it implies that the priestly group that put together Deuteronomy continued on, and from their standpoint they later re-edited the whole shebang. Now, who put the 4 sources together as one continuous narrative? Well, we don't know. We could hypothetically stick the name Ezra on there, but it appears that that our Pentateuch was essentially established when the Persian Emperor Cyrus allowed Jews to go back and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. Ezra, Nehemiah, Zerubbabel, and others, in different waves of resettlement. It says that Ezra, the scribe, came with the law of God in his hand. And that implies, most people think it implies that he had our Pentateuch. Now, that's really been thrown up in the air recently. There are stories in the Pentateuch that seem to reflect things happening after that time, once the temple had been rebuilt. So did they just add a few things? Well, some of the minimalists think, no, actually, J and E are written only in this much later time. Well, I don't know enough about that to say, but that is not strictly germane to what I want to do here. I want to simply point out what we're going to need to know as we consider individual Moses stories, that some of them are parallel, though they differ, because they come from parallel ancient sources. And of course the big inference here is that Moses, of course, did not write the Pentateuch. Now you could still hold out the notion that some of the laws recorded in the Pentateuch come from Moses as a legislator, but that doesn't work very well. Most of them assume a settled agricultural existence in Canaan, whereas Moses would have been laying down laws for desert nomads for 40 years, right? So that doesn't work too well either. But there really is no way Moses wrote these books. You wind up with various gross anachronisms if you think he did. For instance, at one point when they're talking about the Edomites, they say, well, in case you're interested, here's a list of the kings of the Edomites. Yikes. That carries it on centuries after Moses' time right there. And our writer is looking back on these dynasties in Edom. Or one of my favorites, it says, now at this, I think in Genesis, it says, now at this time the Canaanites were still in the land. Well, that implies that this writer is not only living after the time of Joshua, if there was an Israelite conquest of Canaan, but even living way after that, when the legend of an Israelite conquest of Canaan has gained ascendancy. So you're dealing with something way after the time of Moses, if Moses even existed, but let's at least say certainly way after the time in which Moses is set as a fictional character. And then, of course, there's the little detail that Deuteronomy mentions the death of Moses. So, did Moses write that? It seems a little unlikely. Some say, well, he did. He just knew what was going to happen, so he wrote it as if it had. Others say, well, maybe Joshua just added that. Well, who knows? But you see, it never claims that he wrote it. Some people get upset if you say Paul didn't write this or that epistle, because they do have his name on them. So you have to say, well, somebody's fibbing to us. Says Paul wrote this, but in fact he didn't. They're just using his name as a pen name. And some people have trouble with that for purely dogmatic reasons. Right? They don't want a biblical writer deceiving his readers. Sure, well, whatever you think. But you don't have that problem here. There is no statement in any of the books of Moses, quote unquote, that Moses wrote them. Later editors began calling them the books of Moses. In your Bible, yeah, I know it says the first book of Moses, commonly called Genesis, but it's not there in the text. Where did it come from? Well, for some reason, somewhere along the line, the scribes wanted to assign authors, and so they figured, oh, well, Moses is the main character, let's say he wrote it. And what the heck, let's say he wrote Job, too. Yeah, now that's real likely. Let's say Joshua wrote the book of Joshua. It's as if, I wouldn't be surprised if in the case of some of these books, all they meant was, let's name them after the people who are the main characters, and that later people misunderstood that as an authorial claim. I don't know, though, but the point is the book itself does not say this. Yet you will find fundamentalists insisting, Jewish and Christian ones, insisting that, yeah, Moses wrote it all right, so you don't give me any of that documentary hypothesis stuff. Well, why do they say that? In the case of conservative rabbis, because they feel stuck with the traditions of the scribes. In the case of Christians, they think, well, didn't Jesus refer to this as the book of Moses? Didn't he say Moses said, and so forth? Well, what they don't see, I don't know how they miss this, Jesus doesn't, he's not debating somebody. It's not like the Pharisees come up to Jesus and say, tell us, who do you think wrote the Pentateuch? Now, that's not at issue. When he says Moses said, or it says in the book of Moses, it's just a way of referring to the text. Right? That's all you're doing. You're not really bringing up the issue of, well, are we right to call it this, or would there be a better name? So you just cannot say Jesus weighed in on the issue of Mosaic authorship. So it seems to me that that's just a false concern. There's simply no reason theologically to hold that or to have a headache over it. I guess, however, the real reason is that if you admit that there were all sorts of storytellers behind this thing, and then the collectors of them who wrote them down, and editors that put those together, and that they're competing and contradictory traditions, you are loosening up the bolts on the history of it. And that fundamentalists do not want. Again, I'm not quite sure why. Right? I'm not quite sure why they wouldn't accept that there are inspired fictions, since they tend to admit that that's what Jesus was spinning out when he told parables. So why not let the biblical writers do this? I don't know. Well, so we've seen there are the 4 sources behind our stories of Moses, and there are 5 different kinds of legends that have been put together in the narrative. We'll at one point start looking at some of the particular laws, but I am concerned to just get into the stories first, the narratives, to see, if they're not history, what are they? And well, first, I guess I'd like to look at the brief part of the Moses story in Exodus that does look like it's told simply as biography. Whether it actually is that or not, we'll see. I'm thinking of the, right, the birth of Moses and the kind of stuff you have through most of the Charlton Heston movie, which, for my money, by the way, the Charlton Heston, C.B. DeMille, the 10 Commandments, that is the definitive version of the Moses story. I mean, Exodus is pretty good, but DeMille and Heston are really the definitive version. My people, here are the 10 amendments. The second amendment, thou shalt have the right to keep and bear arms. Now, let's face it, if Moses existed, he should have been like Heston. If he spoke, he should have spoken that way. Let's face it. So keep old Heston in mind, if you will. I'll tell you one reason that movie is so darn great. It understands that it's dealing with myth. So it's got to be in Technicolor. It's got to have special effects. It's got to be larger than life. The Burt Lancaster movie, Moses, really failed in this because they were trying to make it look as if it would if there really had been a Moses. Let's just forget it. Right? You just can't do that. Moses is a kind of a superhuman character. What about the great story of Moses as an infant being cast adrift on the Nile? Well, this one, all we need to say is that I want to get back into this for another reason, but well, let's just say right off the bat, this is an etymological story. It's told to explain why the founder of the Hebrew religion has an Egyptian name. Because Moses is the same root we find in various pharaoh names, like Tutmos, or spelled as if it were to be said Thutmose, but it'd be Tutmos. Or the famous Ramses, The C's part of it, though the O syllable there is dropped out, that's the same root again. And so what does it mean? It means begotten, or son of. So Tutmos, that meant the Pharaoh who bore that name was the son of the god Thoth, or Tut. And Ramesses, it means he's the son of Ra, the sun god. Tutmos, Thoth has begotten him. Ramesses, Ra has begotten him. The pharaohs were all supposed to be fathered by one or another of the gods, and so was Moses apparently. But they've chopped half the name off. This is a royal name, and indeed Moses is often depicted in terms of the sacred kings of the ancient Middle Eastern countries, but we only have the begotten part. Well, what would the rest of it have been? I don't know, but it's sure interesting. I think the Mormons, I think Joseph Smith luckily hit on something when he came up with the name Mosiah. Sounds like a biblical name. I suppose it could be one, but I don't think it ever occurs in the Bible. But what would it mean? It'd be half Hebrew, half Egyptian. It would mean Yahweh has begotten him, the son of Yahweh. Well, who knows? I have no idea. Maybe he was son of Sebek, the crocodile god, for all I know. But half of it, the divine name, has been chopped off. Right, that's no surprise. Like one of the psalmists says, I will not so much as take the name of their gods on my lips. So they've chopped that, but they want to hide the original Egyptian character of the name. And so someone has decided, well, what else could Moses or Moshe in Hebrew mean? What could it be derived from? And somebody said, well, the closest of our words to Moshe is masha, to draw out of or pull out of. So what do you got with the story of the infant who has not yet been named? He's a newborn, and he's sent out to trust to the providence of God in what is in effect a kind of a picnic basket of a boat. Well, his little life is saved when the thing beaches in the reeds where the daughter of Pharaoh is bathing, and she sees it and says to some of her maidens, go pick the thing up, let's see what's in it. Holy mackerel, it's a baby. And since he's circumcised, implicitly, they say, oh, it's one of the Hebrews' babies. That my dad's trying to get rid of all of them. But I just can't let this cute little guy go. And so she adopts him as her own and claims that who knows what she would have said, right? Some sort of liaison. Freud believed that that there was a historical Moses and that he was an Egyptian. And he was the illegitimate son of the daughter of Pharaoh and who knows who else. And that she said, well, I found him in the Nile. It's just an excuse. Pretty clever. He's granting too much to the story as a piece of history. The story is told to say, aha, his life was saved because he was drawn out of the reeds of the river. So no alligator got him or anything. So they must have named him for how he was saved. Moshe, Masha, the one drawn out of the water. Well, that's not the case. There's no way that the daughter of Pharaoh is going to give the kid a Hebrew name. And it isn't a Hebrew name. But you see what's going on now. Couldn't they have had him drawn out of anything? Why the boat scenario? Well, that's a very old myth. That was told of Sargon, the Assyrian emperor, a couple of thousand years before this. It was told of Theseus and various others, or of Romulus and Remus and so on. They're set adrift, but divine providence sees to it that they remain alive to do their great heroic work. Right? So, is it a biographical story? Well, yeah, but borrowed, insofar as there's more going on than the name explanation. It's simply borrowed from another character or the general mythical stew back then. You know, there's this show on cable, Talk Soup, or these days just The Soup. Well, you could have Myth Soup and see how many different figures have used the same myths over and over again. Right, well, you jump ahead to where Moses is an adult, and it's not quite clear where along the line he learns that he's a Hebrew. I know you might be thinking of the definitive version, the Charlton Heston movie, where he learns it later on in the story, but that's just a good guess. We don't really know if he was raised knowing his Israelite heritage or what. I mean, I don't mean in actual historical fact, of course. I mean, what does the writer intend? Well, he doesn't make it clear. But at some point, he knows who he is, and we have this great story where he goes out and sees an Egyptian foreman oppressing one of his Hebrew slaves who's working to build a storage city for Pharaoh, and he says, "Hey, look, you can't do this," and he kills the guy. And then the next day he goes out again and sees two fellow Hebrews having a fight, and he says, "Look, you should be on the same side here. Cut it out." And they say, "Oh, what? Who made you our boss? Who made you a judge over us? What, are you going to kill one of us like you killed that Egyptian the other day?" And Moses says, "Oh my gosh. And I thought nobody had seen that. Now I'm going to be in trouble." In fact, here's the story. In Exodus 2:11. "One day when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, two Hebrews were struggling together. And he said to the man that did the wrong, 'Why do you strike your fellow?' He answered, 'Who made you a prince and a judge over us?' 'What, do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?' Then Moses was afraid and thought, 'Surely the thing is known.' When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh." By the way, they were all called Pharaoh. It's sort of like Caesar. Sort of a name, but really a title. "Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well." There's another tale that hangs from this. Now you might think, well, this is pretty good stuff. This sounds autonomous. Why shouldn't this be historically true, and so forth? But give a listen to a story about Jacob. We're going to find some very surprising parallels between Moses and Jacob. Or can we be friends here, Mo and Jake? I guess we ought to call them Moses and Jacob. Sorry. All right. In Genesis 27:41. Oh man, I love this whole story. Let me just summarize it in case you've forgotten this. This is worth going over because it makes an important point. We're going to have the tail end of this Jacob story match the tail end of that little Moses episode, taking it on the lamb. But we're going to see that this Jacob story has a lot more to it, and that makes the flight of the hero more of an integral continuation of it. So let's start back at the beginning of chapter 27 of Genesis now to look at the long Jacob version. We got a few weeks here, right? Why not take our time on this? Okay. When Isaac was old and his eyes were dim so that he could not see, he called Esau, his older son, and said to him, "My son?" He answered, "Here I am." He said, "Behold, I am old. I do not know the day of my death. Now then, take your weapons, your quiver and your bow, and go out to the field and hunt game for me, and prepare for me savory food such as I love, and bring it to me that I may eat, that I may bless you before I die." Now, a blessing would really count It's like good things are going to happen. You know, the deathbed blessing of the patriarch, it's going to happen. So he will be rewarded. Because Isaac, of course, you know, God loves him, and God will see to it that whatever he says happens. Right? So anyway, 27:5. Now Rebekah was listening when Isaac spoke to his son Esau. So when Esau went to the field to hunt for game and bring it, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, I heard your father speak to your brother Esau, bring me game and prepare for me savory food that I may eat it and bless you before Yahweh, before I die. Now therefore, my son, obey my word as I command you. Go to the flock and fetch me 2 good kids, that is, baby goats, right, that I may prepare from them savory food for your father, such as he loves. And you shall bring it to your father to eat, so that he may bless you before he dies. Boy, you really got a dysfunctional family here, right? The 2 parents each have a favorite, and they're playing one off against another. Oh, what a mess. Okay, verse 11, but Jacob said to Rebekah, his mother, behold, my brother Esau is a hairy man, and I'm a smooth man. Perhaps my father will feel me, and I shall seem to be mocking him, and bring a curse upon myself, and not a blessing. His mother said to him, upon me be your curse, my son. Only obey my word and go. Fetch them to me. So he went and took them and brought them to his mother, and his mother prepared savory food such as his father loved. Then Rebekah took the best garments of Esau, her older son, which were with her in the house, and put them on Jacob, her younger son. And the skins of the kids she put upon his hands and upon the smooth part of his neck, and she gave the savory food and the bread which she had prepared into the hand of her son Jacob. So he went in to his father and said, my father. He said, here I am. Who are you, my son? Remember, the old guy's blind, right? Which one are you? Jacob said to his father, I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Now sit up and eat of my game, that you may bless me. But Isaac said to his son, how is it that you found it so quickly, my son? He answered, because Yahweh your God granted me success. That's a ticket. Then Isaac said to Jacob, come near that I may feel you, my son, to know whether you really are my son Esau or not. So Jacob went near to Isaac his father, who felt him and said, the voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau. I mean, you can see this fiction, right? He's got goat hides on his hands. And what was Esau, the wolf man or something? Anyway, and he did not recognize him, because his hands were hairy like his brother Esau's hands. So he blessed him. He said, are you really my son Esau? He answered, I am. Then he said, bring it to me that I may eat of my son's game and bless you. So he brought it to him, and he ate, and he brought him wine, and he drank. Then his father Isaac said to him, come near and kiss me, my son. Now, this old guy's no fool, right? He just wants to check again. So he came near and kissed him, and he smelled the smell of his garments, and blessed him, and said, see, the smell of my son is as the smell of a field which Yahweh has blessed. May God give you of the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth, and plenty of grain and wine. Let people serve you, and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you. As soon as Isaac had finished blessing Jacob, when Jacob had scarcely gone out from the presence of Isaac his father, Esau his brother came in from his hunting. He also prepared savory food and brought it to his father. And he said to his father, let my father arise and eat of his son's game, that you may bless me. His father Isaac said to him, who are you? And said, I'm your son, your firstborn, Esau. Then Isaac trembled violently and said, who was it then that hunted game and brought it to me, and I ate it all before you came, and I blessed him? Yes, and he shall be blessed. In other words, can't do anything about it now. When Esau heard the words of his father, he cried out with an exceedingly great and bitter cry, and said to his father, bless me, even me also, O my father. But he said, your brother came with guile, and he's taken away your blessing. Esau said, "Is he not rightly named Jacob?" Which means supplanter. "For he supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and behold, now he has taken away my blessing." He said, "Have you not reserved a blessing for me?" If that sounds like an add-on, rest assured it is. Isaac answered Esau, "Behold, I've made him your lord, and all his brothers I've given to him for servants, and with grain and wine I've sustained him. What then can I do for you, my son?" Esau said to his father, "Have you but one blessing, my father? Bless me, even me also, O my father." And Esau lifted up his voice and wept. Then Isaac, his father, answered him, "Behold, away from the fatness of the earth shall your dwelling be, away from the dew of heaven on high. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. But when you break loose, you shall break his yoke from your neck." Now Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And Esau said to himself, "The days of mourning for my father are approaching. Then I will kill my brother Jacob." But the words of Esau, her older son, were told to Rebekah. So she sent and called Jacob, her younger son, said to him, "And behold, your brother Esau comforts himself by planning to kill you. Now therefore, my son, obey my voice. Arise, flee to Laban, my brother, in Haran, and stay with him a while until your brother's fury turns away, until your brother's anger turns away, and he forgets what you have done to him." What you have done to him. "Then I will send and fetch you from there. Why should I be bereft of you both in one day?" You both? Who's that? Well, not Jacob and Esau, Jacob and Isaac. Apparently Isaac is about to die. He's right. I mean, I could think this whole thing has to do with the last meal, and he wants his favorite stuff right before he dies. Well, he's going to die any minute, and his wife's saying, who's a lot younger than him, saying, I'm going to lose him. I don't want to lose one of my sons, too, so get out of here until I tell you the coast is clear. What's this story really about? Well, I'll tell you one thing, it's basically a series of ethnological stories. Everybody knew that Esau, who stands for Edom, the Edomites, he's elsewhere in the text, he's said to be their father, the father of the whole 12-tribe league of Edomites. Everybody had 12-tribe leagues back then. The Edomites were the older civilization. How they determined this, I don't know, but they figured it was true. The older civilization, but that the Israelites were their cousins. And sometimes it took no more than geographical proximity to establish such a thing in their minds. We must be related. Sometimes it had to do with trade agreements. Whoever had the better end of the stick was the older one, whatever. But the odd thing was that at least when the story was being told, the Israelites ruled over the Edomites. And so this story is told by Israelites to explain that oddity, which worked pretty good for them. The Edomites are our superiors in war and so forth. They're great hunters, and they're more manly and all that, whereas we're sort of like Felix Unger. We're smooth men. We dwell in tents. We don't go out for hunting and war and all that. But we're tricky. We're crafty. And that's how we beat those stupid hicks. That's why we're on top and we rule the Edomites. Well, again, biblical minimalism has thrown all this stuff into the air, but the way we are used to explaining this anyway, this story would have come from the time of David or Solomon, and it would have said, well, you see, we have conquered them. They're part of the Davidic Empire now, even though they are the older group. But what's this thing that Isaac had up his sleeve, a last-minute P.S. blessing for the Edomites after all? Well, at one point, you're going to rise up and throw off the yoke of your brother. Well, this is a revision of the story to update it until the time of Solomon and Rehoboam, when these little border countries like the Edomites threw off the Israelite yoke. At least, the traditional history of it had it that Solomon was simply not interested in maintaining his father's empire. He just wanted to beautify the homeland. And so the other countries took the opportunity one by one to leave, and that the Edomites did, and that would be the origin of this little bit. And in general, it explains why the Edomites were eternal enemies with Israel. In fact, when the Babylonians, hundreds of years later, when they attacked Judah, the Edomites welcomed them in and said, hey, if you need a hand slaughtering those Israelites, we're happy to help. So, real bad blood. And so here is a long story, and there's more to it than this even, but it issues in Jacob taking it on the lamb to go to the east to stay with his uncle Laban. And of course, what happens when he gets there, right? He meets the love of his life and so on. Well, Moses leaves to go east too. He goes to Midian. In a single verse it says that. I'm betting that the Moses version is secondary to the Jacob version, partly because it looks as if the patriarchal stories are older than the Moses stories. They're about the origin of the nation rather than the niceties of the religion. Albrecht Alt's theory was that this linking of the three big names, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, represented an alliance of three tribal groups, each named for their ancestor, whether he had been a real person or a myth, who knows, could have been either one. And each had its own god. And so they, depending on who was mightier or older or whatever, they set up a seniority among the three groups, so that they made the earliest one Abraham. He's the father of the others. Then, and the God of Abraham becomes their God, and they call him in the Bible the God of Abraham. Then Isaac, originally no relation, is tied in as his son. And his God, the fear of Isaac, who is mentioned only once, but it's a kind of a strange epithet, implying sort of a superstitious totem. The fear of Isaac becomes a name for the God of Abraham. He's second in the list, and then the youngest or weakest of the three groups, Jacob, is added on, and their tribal deity, the deity of their patriarch, was the strong one or the mighty one of Jacob. And so they now figure, well, maybe these are all the same God, and he dealt with these three generations, and that's how it winds up being narrated. But even that is an ethnological story, so the stories of the patriarchs would go back to an earlier time than the Moses stories. This is all theoretical, but for one thing, they're more fundamental. That would explain one odd thing that Gunkel pointed out. He said none of these stories of the patriarchs could be historical because they involve day-to-day life details in the tents of these patriarchs. You're telling me that 400 years of the Egyptian bondage went by with no recollections preserved, but people remembered what had happened centuries before that in detail, so they knew what Abraham had said to Hagar and so on? Well, it's clear it's fiction. But it's also clear that they're separate cycles of fiction, and it seems as if the Moses stories are borrowed from the Jacob stories to make, needless to say, to make Moses sort of a new Jacob. Jacob was the national hero. Moses becomes the religious hero. I mean, after all, the nation is named for Jacob, who's also called Israel, but he's the guy. Okay, now, let's pursue this a little bit more here with the next episode. Let's jump back over to Exodus now and see what happens to Moses when he goes east. This is in Exodus 2:16 and 17 and following. This is real well handled in the movie too. Okay, now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and no sons, right? That's real important for the story. He had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. The shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. When they came to their father Reuel, he said, "How is it that you've come so soon today?" You see what that means? Right, even though there's 7 of these women, they're always shoved aside by these chauvinistic bastards. So they always have to wait to get the water until after all these guys are done. And this time they didn't have to, and so the dad says, "Hey, you're back awful soon." Verse 19, they said, "An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds and even drew water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, "And where is he? Why have you left the man? Call him that he may eat bread." Of course, he's thinking, well, I can palm off one of the gals at least on this guy. You let this one slip through your fingers. Go find it, for Pete's sake. We can use a guy like this around here. And 21, Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah. I believe they call her Zephra in the movie. She bore a son, and he called his name Gershom, which means sojourner. Ger means sojourner, temporary resident. Therefore he said, "I have been a sojourner in a foreign land." Well, need I say, that little bit of it is an etymological tale. They named him Gershom. Well, it kind of sounds like Ger, a resident alien. So Moses must have been one when he had this son. All right, he's now established as working for his dad. But it starts with him meeting the native women at the well once he goes east. Well, not to be outdone, old Jacob has pretty much the same thing happen. And I'm skipping some Jacob material, but 29:1 of Genesis. Then Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the people of the east. As he looked, he saw a well in the field, and lo, 3 flocks of sheep lying beside it. For out of that well the flocks were watered. The stone on the well's mouth was large, and when all the flocks were gathered there, the shepherds would roll the stone from the mouth of the well and water the sheep, and put the stone back in its place over the mouth of the well. Jacob said to them, "My brothers, where do you come from?" They said, "We are from Haran." He said to them, "Do you know Laban, the son of Nahor?" They said, "We know him." He said to them, "Is it well with him?" They said, "It is well. And see, Rachel, his daughter, is coming with the sheep." He said, "Behold, it is high day. It is not time for the animals to be gathered together. Water the sheep and go pasture them." But they said, "We cannot until all the flocks are gathered together and the stone is rolled from the mouth of the well. Then we water the sheep." While he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she kept them. Right, there's no young man to do it. Now, when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, Jacob went up and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. So he does this single-handedly, right? The other guys, it's such a huge production to move this lid. They wait for all the shepherds to get there, but he says, "Hey, look, this is for Rachel here. I'll do it myself." So this kind of fills in a gap from the Moses thing. He distinguishes himself. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and wept aloud. Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's kinsman and that he was Rebekah's son, and she ran and told her father. When Laban heard the tidings of his sister's son, he ran to meet him and embraced him and kissed him and brought him into his house. Jacob told Laban all these things, and Laban said, "Surely you are my bone and my flesh." And he stayed with him a month. Okay, so at the well, he meets his wife. And it's very similar. It seems clear it's another version of the same thing. In fact, this one gets told again when actually we would already have seen it if we were going systematically through Genesis. When Abraham sent Eliezer of Damascus to find Rebekah to marry Isaac, we had the same thing with the well and so on. We got another version of it with Jesus and the woman at the well in the Gospel of John. It's a type scene, as Robert Alter says in his book, The Art of Biblical Narrative. Okay, now what's the next episode? Once our hero marries the woman from the east, he serves his father-in-law as a herdsman. Again, I think this is no coincidence. So, let us hear the rustling of the old Bible pages here. Let's take a look at Exodus 3:1. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Wait a second, I thought his father-in-law's name was Reuel. Well, he's called Jethro here, and that's actually later on. He's also going to be called Hobab. Well, this seems to have to do with sources too, but it's not that clear how they break down. Some people have thought, well, if Jay collected stories from different places, there would have been contradictions between some of them, just as there are between Jay's final version and E's. So, what a mess. But anyway, pick the name. Reuel, for whom Tolkien is named, right? John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. Or Jethro, like the illustrious Jethro Bodine on the Beverly Hillbillies. Or Hobab, which just somehow brings up camel jokes. I'm not quite sure why, but anyhow. But Jacob had already gotten a similar high-paying position back in Genesis 29:18, for instance. Well, 15 and following. Laban said to Jacob, "Because you are my kinsman, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what shall your wages be?" Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were weak, whatever that means, but Rachel was beautiful and lovely. Jacob loved Rachel, and he said, "I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter Rachel." Laban said, "It is better that I give her to you than that I should give her to any other man. Stay with me." So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love he had for her. Then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife, that I may go in to her, for my time is completed." And you know what happens, right? He sneaks in Leah instead. So he's had sex with her, and in the morning light realizes, hold on a second, this isn't the one I bargained for. And so Jacob says, okay, Laban says, special deal, I'll throw in the other one too if you'll work for me. Another 7 years. And say, no good skin point. Well, all right. And so it goes through the next chapter, and there are all kinds of things he does to multiply the herd and the flock, that is, and becomes the rival to his uncle. It's very much like Abraham and Lot earlier in Genesis, where they both have huge holdings and flocks and herds and so forth. And but that's not the end of it. There is suddenly a moment where God tells the hero to get out of there and go back west where he came from. The time has come. In Genesis 3, of course, this is the big scene at the burning bush where he learns the name. I'm sorry, that should be Exodus 3, of course, as you already knew. So Moses is grazing the flock and comes to Horeb, the mountain of God. Now that's within the territory of Jethro, which is why Jethro is the priest of Midian. He sort of owns the mountain of God. So he serves him there. Okay, 3:2. the angel of Yahweh appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and lo, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush is not burnt up. Right? When Yahweh saw that he turned aside to see, Elohim called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. Then he said, Do not come near. Put off your shoes from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then Yahweh said, I have seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I've come down from heaven. Right? I've come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I've seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring forth my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to Elohim, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? He said, But I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought forth the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God upon this mountain, and so on. Okay, I want you to go back west where you came from. There's more of the story, but that's enough for the moment. And that seems to repeat Genesis 31:13. After various wranglings with his cheapskate Uncle Laban, and we thought Jacob was guileful. This guy makes him look like a Boy Scout. Genesis 31:13. And let's go back up a little bit. Verse 11. Then the angel of Elohim said to me in a dream, Jacob. And I said, Here I am. And he said, Lift up your eyes and see. So on all the flocks and such. I've seen all that Laban is doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. Now arise, go forth from this land, and return to the land of your birth. And so he gets ready and does it. We got a pretty similar story here. Now, they both do it. In Exodus 4:20, we have a little note. Moses took his wife and his sons and set them on a donkey and went back to the land of Egypt. And in his hand Moses took the rod of God. Does Jacob do it? Yes, he does. In Genesis 31:17 and following. So Jacob arose and set his sons and his wives on camels, and he drove away all his cattle, all his livestock which he had gained, the cattle in his possession which he had acquired in Paddan Aram, to go to the land of Canaan to his father Isaac. Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel stole her father's household gods. And Jacob outwitted Laban the Aramean, in that he did not tell him that he intended to flee. He fled with all he had, and arose and crossed the Euphrates, and set his face toward the hill country of Gilead. And Laban finds out, and he comes back, and they have a confrontation, but they make an agreement to live and let live, and so forth. But that's not the end of the story either. And with this one, we'll let it go, but this is a pretty bang-up ending. On the way back, though God has sent him, God ambushes him. And this may take the cake for the single weirdest story in the Bible. Exodus 4:24 through 26. Okay, at a lodging place on the way, that is, back to Egypt, Yahweh met him and sought to kill him. Then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet, so that's a euphemism for his penis, touched Moses' penis with it and said, "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me." So he, Yahweh, let him, Moses, alone. Then it was that she said, "You're a bridegroom of blood," because of the circumcision. What? What is going on here? It's not that tough to explain. You see, Israel, some of them anyway, some of the Israelites had practiced bridegroom circumcision. That circumcision is practiced this way even today in some cultures as part of a puberty rite. When the adolescent males get old enough to be considered marriageable, today I am a man. And part of that involves circumcision, and painful, right? And you're going to remember this little initiation. But there are cultures, of course, that have infant circumcision, and at some point, Israel, or at least some of the tribal components within it, some of the Israelite groups, made a changeover. My guess is the minority decided to go and conform with the majority, and they had to convince everybody that they were going to change their ancient custom and forget about bridegroom circumcision and switch over to infant circumcision. But you don't make a change like that easily. I mean, think of the ire aroused today when some critics of Judaism say, "Oh, you're being inhuman by circumcising that baby. You're just mutilating him. You don't care how he feels," and so on. I can think of a hilarious Seinfeld episode about this, with my favorite Seinfeld character, Shaky the Moil. But at any rate, I'd love to see a whole series about this guy. But at any rate, if you're going to change a thing like this, you better have Moses or somebody just as good throwing his authority behind it. And so that's what happens in this story, which originally had no larger context. All you had was, well, okay, Moses himself had not been circumcised. Now I'm guessing, according to that story where he's in the picnic basket floating down the Nile, it's assumed that he had been. You ever wonder why they've got this cloth in the little boat with him in the movie, and that later on he's wearing a mantle made of that? It's just like baby Kal-El comes to Earth with the red, yellow, and blue swaddling clothes that Ma Kent eventually makes into a Superman outfit. Same sort of a thing, because they're very similar characters, right? But the reason they make sure that cloth is in there is they figure, well, we don't want to get into stuff like circumcision in this movie, but the daughter of Pharaoh has to know that this kid is a Jewish baby. So how about if she recognizes the Jewish cloth that's their kind of weaving? Okay. But at any rate, in this one, Moses managed not to be circumcised, but God wants people circumcised, and so he tries to kill Moses, who now we must imagine is pictured as not being circumcised against God's will somehow. I mean, who knows what backstory is implied there. But God is about to kill him for disobedience until Moses' wife resourcefully butts in and says, "Oh, no, you don't. If you've got to have your token ounce of flesh, here's the baby's foreskin. Let's pretend that it counts for Dad, too." So she touches little Gershom's swiftly cut off foreskin to the end of Moses' member, and so Moses apparently still doesn't get circumcised, and the blood of the one counts for that of the other, and so now everybody should be like Gershom instead of like Moses. And so now what's it doing here? Why has Yahweh just told Moses to get his butt on the road back to Egypt? and then tried to kill him. Well, the poor compiler didn't feel like he could get rid of a Moses story, especially a ceremonial story like this one, a precedent for switching over the age of circumcision. He's got to put it somewhere. And Moses has to be with his family on the road somewhere. Well, his family is not with him during the Exodus events. They're sent on ahead back to Midian. So it can't be then, but it can't be earlier, because they're not going anywhere. I mean, he meets his wife in Midian once he gets there. So what, are they going to go on a National Lampoon vacation somewhere? Well, it's got to be when they first go to Egypt. So he puts it there, even though it makes nonsense of the context. But, that's as near as I can figure as to why this is here. And it sure made a lot more sense over in Genesis when it first happened to Jacob. You're thinking, now wait a second, what's this doing in the Bible at all, much less twice? Well, we'll see. In 32 we have an interesting tale. I won't read the whole thing, but Jacob is on his way back with his wives and his 2 concubines. He's added them to the harem, and his various children, and his enormous holdings of livestock of all kinds, and his treasure and so on. And he hears that his brother Esau is coming with an armed force to meet him. Oh no, I was hoping I'd avoided this by staying out of the way all this time, but I got such a huge movement of people here. The rumors have gotten back to him. He's going to get his revenge. I guess he hasn't cooled off. So he says, okay, we're going to divide our huge group into 2, and we'll meet back up. But this way, I'll go with one of you. And if Esau finds the one and kills everybody, well, at least we got the other batch of us alive. And so he's shaking in his boots. And he sends him across the river Jabbok, and he knows it may be battle the next day. And he sets aside a whole bunch of the stuff to give his brother if he sees him as a peace offering and such. And he's hoping for the best. Well, in 32, he thought, I may appease him. Verse 20, with the present that goes before me, and afterward I shall see his face. Keep that line in mind. Perhaps he will accept me. Okay, he lodges that night in the camp. They all go before him, and he's alone. He's going to follow him. Verse 22, the same night he arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 maids, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream, and likewise everything he had, and Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw... Now, who is this? Well, that's the whole issue. It's sort of like, who is the young man in Jesus' tomb at the end of Mark? Matthew couldn't decide if he's supposed to be an angel or the risen Christ. So he makes them both. Well, similar strategic ambiguity here. A man wrestled with him till the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and Jacob's thigh was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then the assailant said, let me go, for the day is breaking. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And he said, well, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. Then he said, your name shall no more be called Jacob, but Israel, which might mean he who strives with God, or probably is supposed to mean God strives, like, may God strive on your behalf. But it could mean the one who strives with God. And so that's what's in view here. Your name shall no more be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men, and have prevailed. Who does he have in mind with men? Well, Laban, probably. Maybe not only him, though. Then Jacob asked him, "Tell me, I pray, your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, which means face of God, face of Elohim, saying, "For I have seen Elohim face to face, and yet my life is preserved." The sun rose upon him as he passed Penuel, which is another version of the same name, limping because of his thigh. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the sinew of the hip, which is upon the hollow of the thigh, because he touched the hollow of Jacob's thigh on the sinew of the hip. Okay, we got a ceremonial story here. It explains two things. This odd dietary regulation that no one could remember the reason for, not eating that particular thigh muscle of any animal, even if it was otherwise kosher. But also a particular ritual dance done in Penuel, a holy place named because someone claimed to have seen the face of God there, Peniel or Penuel, either one. And they did this limping dance. Much later, we will see the priests of Baal limping about the altar. There was a kind of you've seen this in old westerns, right? The Indians dance around the fire, and they go from one foot crouching on it to the other. That's the same idea. So this explains why everybody's doing the limp, and why they won't eat this muscle. And it explains the name of the place. Did the patriarch Jacob see God there? Well, somebody must have. So why not him? They wouldn't have named it that way otherwise. Well, what happens next? He sees Esau. I won't read the whole thing, but his brother's in a forgiving mood. He won't even accept the present that Jacob has set aside for him. And and then he introduces his family, and it's a joyous reunion and all that stuff. And boy, is Jacob surprised. In 33:9, wait a minute, let's see. 10, let's see. Jacob said, "I pray you, if I have found favor in your sight, then accept my present from my hand, for truly, to see your face is like seeing the face of God. With such favor have you received me." You see what's going on here? I could be wrong, but I think what we have is a great story in which Esau had decided to forgive him. He wasn't going to kill him, but by God, he wasn't going to let him get away with what he had done. So he finds Jacob by himself the previous night, under the cover of darkness, and he won't tell him his name, but he decides to beat the hell out of him for old time's sake, and then, all right, the score is settled. Then he can come back in his own name, as if he hadn't seen him the night before, and let bygones be bygones. That's why he has to get away before the sun rises. And that's why Jacob, who nonetheless recognizes him, says, "You know, bro, seeing your face is like seeing the face of God." So, because that was the God he had striven with. He tried to deceive him, but he understood, and he's willing to accept it. Peace on those terms is peace. What the heck? Now, one reason I'm going into all this detail is to say you can see how the Jacob stories are both much more detailed and serve all kinds of underlying form-critical purposes. Their name origin stories, their ceremonial precedents, they're there to explain the relation of the Edomites to the Israelites and so on. Whereas there's only very little of that in the Moses versions. There's a bit, but most of those are shorter and sweeter, and therefore seem to be summaries of the Jacob stories, just substituting the name Moses in order to give Moses something answering to a biography. I'm getting this, by the way, from a great, great book, which you ought to read, Robert Graves and Raphael Patai, Hebrew Myths, the Book of Genesis. My copy is 1983 from Greenwich House Publishers, a subsidiary of Crown Publishers. I'm not sure who does it now, though I think it is still in print. So we've got all of these 6 segments of the story. Moses and Jacob both flee eastward, afraid for their lives. They then meet a native woman at the well and help her against the shepherds. Each man then serves his father-in-law as a herdsman. Then God appears to him again and says, go back west. He does, and then is ambushed by a god, or what seems to be, and what may originally have been. So it looks as if that much of Moses' biography is actually taken from Jacob. A lot of these guys tend to assimilate the stories of their predecessors, because if you're trying to come up with a new hero, he better be at least as good as the old one. All right. Could Freud have been right that Moses was originally supposed to have been an Egyptian? Well, maybe so, because he does, after all, have an Egyptian name. Now, I don't think as Freud did. Freud is sort of a new Moses figure. I don't think that there was a historical Moses and that the truth about him was that he was an Egyptian. But the Moses character, I suspect, was some sort of an Egyptian character, given the name. So he's got sort of a point there. But, of course, he and others have tried to tie a historical Moses into Egyptian history. And the favorite place to do that is with Akhenaten, the heretic emperor who exalted one of the sun gods of Egypt, the sun disk, Aten, to be the chief or perhaps the only god. Usually we've taken Akhenaten to be the partisan of an early monotheism, and Freud understood him that way, but others have said, well, no, not really. He just made Aten the chief god. I don't know enough about it to be sure of that one, but it is interesting that Akhenaten does have a footnote in the Bible, even if not here. And that is because it appears that the great hymn of the sun attributed to Akhenaten, the hymn to Aten, you find it in the Bible. It has been grafted into Psalm 19. Let's read a little bit of that just to make the point. I know this is slightly off track, but not really. And if you don't hear it here, where are you going to hear it? Tell me that. So, like its longer cousin, Psalm 119, this is a scribal psalm glorifying the Torah, but it's based on Akhenaten's hymn to the sun, which we still have from Egyptian sources. Listen to this, great stuff. The heavens are telling the glory of Elohim, and the firmament, the firmament is the solid dome of the heavens. The firmament proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night declares knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard, yet their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. In them, in the heavens that is, he has set a tent for the sun, which comes forth like a bridegroom leaving his chamber, and like a strong man runs its course with joy. Its rising is from the end of the heavens, and its circuit to the end of them, and there is nothing hid from its heat. pause there. I want you to remember that line. He has set in the heavens a tent for the sun. And keep that in mind when we talk about the tent of meeting, where Moses meets with God and comes out with his face shining like the sun. Sort of indicates Moses' origin as a sun god. He comes forth like a bridegroom leaving his chamber. Well, there's the bridegroom of blood, though, and like a strong man runs his course with joy. I would tuck that away to when you look next at Samson and the wedding feast story there, and so on. Samson's name simply means the sun. But enough of him for the moment. We'll get back to him another time when we explain Moses as a sun god. Okay, Psalm 19, verse 7. We get the scribal part. The law of Yahweh is perfect, reviving the soul. The testimony, another word for commandment, of Yahweh is sure, making wise the simple. The precepts of Yahweh are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of Yahweh is pure, enlightening the eyes. The fear of Yahweh is clean, enduring forever. The ordinances of Yahweh are true and righteous altogether. More to be desired are they than gold, even much fine gold. Sweeter also than honey and the drippings of the honeycomb. Moreover, by them is thy servant warned. In keeping them there is great reward. But who can discern his errors? Clear thou me from hidden faults. Keep back thy servant also from presumptuous sins. Let them not have dominion over me. Then I shall be blameless and innocent of great transgression. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Yahweh, my rock and my redeemer. That scene, now that, of course, need I say, is just one of the great spiritual lyrics of the Bible. But what's it doing here on the tail end of this thing about the sun? Well, because one of the associations of the sun god in antiquity, whether you're talking about Shamash or Apollo, is that he gives the law to the king. At the top of the great carven text of the Code of Hammurabi, what does it show? Shamash, the sun, handing the commandments to the Emperor Hammurabi. Same thing here. The sun god gives him the laws as Apollo did. And Moses is a lawgiver and associated with a tent of meeting, and his face glows like the sun. So some of these things fit together. Finally, with Akhenaten, or Ikhnaton, as some people say, with an older pronunciation, part of the hymn that is attributed to him runs, O Aten, no man knoweth thee, save for thy son Akhenaten. Does that ring a bell with you? Does that not kind of sound a bit like what Jesus says in Q and Matthew and Luke, where he says, I thank thee, Father, that thou hast withheld these things from the wise, but revealed them unto the infants. All things have been delivered to me by my Father. No one knows the Father except for the Son, and any to whom the Son deigns to reveal him. Could that possibly be borrowed from Akhenaten's hymn to the sun? I wouldn't be too surprised. After all, Jesus' face shining like the sun on the mountaintop surely is borrowed from Moses. So anyway, there's a lot to this, and repays a lot of careful study. What I want to do starting next time is to group the various Moses stories according to these 5 categories to explain. I mean, these now we're dealing with very short little nuggets of stories. It'll be no problem to deal with them. I want to show, for instance, next time the ceremonial and legal precedents Doing so, we'll see doublets. We'll see we have, with several of these stories, one from the P source, one from the E source, etc., and we can compare how they've embellished them a bit differently, and so on. Then after that, and we'll look at a couple of other ones that are not even about Moses, but reinforce the form critical category to show you what kind of a thing we're dealing with here. Then we will take a look at the priestcraft or cautionary tales, which are yet another kind of ceremonial story. They're warnings. Now, don't you do this. Don't do what these guys did and got incinerated for it. As they used to say in the VD film shown in the army to the soldiers, men, don't let this happen to you. Then we'll take a look at a bunch of geological stories, because there are a bunch of those. You know, how this spring over here, which used to be poison, get to be drinkable? You know, where does this water fountain come from? I guess Moses must have stayed here. Then there are a bunch of etymological stories where we explain the name Moses, as we've already seen, but also Mara, Meribah, Massah, Taberah, Kibroth, Hormah, various other places where Moses and the others are said to have had adventures during their wilderness wanderings. Then we'll take a look at the ethnological stories about the no-good Amalekites and the lousy Edomites and those rotten Canaanites and those dirty Amorites and those highly annoying Midianites and so on, which kind of plant the seeds for some of the Joshua stories of massacre. Then I want to take a closer look at the text of a rather long story, of course, the story of the plagues and the actual Exodus. Then the crossing of the Sea of Reeds and theories about what the miracle was and what the eruption of Sinai was actually about. Then I want to get into the pair of decalogues, the two different sets of 10 commandments. Where are they? Where they come from? Why are they different? And then laying side by side the provisions of the Book of the Covenant, so-called, and Deuteronomy and the priestly code. And I want to take a look at the great story of the golden calf, which used to be a ceremonial story up north, but was made into a big joke by the southern redactor. And there should be plenty to chew on here in this fascinating business of the origins of the Moses character. And of course I'm calling the thing the Quest of the Historical Moses, simply to parallel it to the famous Albert Schweitzer title, The Quest of the Historical Jesus. Not that there was a historical Moses, right? I guess that's the big difference. And one day we make this one into a book as well. So have your Bible ready. I'm using the Revised Standard Version, but use any Bible. Maybe it'd be better to use a different one, just to see some of the different possible nuances. But it sure would be good if you could have a Bible and open it and follow along. If you want to ask questions about this, and I hope you will. Of course, I'm not doing this live, so you would have to leave the questions on the Bible Geek site, and I would hasten to answer them. And the answers would be, I would post the answers, probably. I don't know, I'll give it some thought. Maybe I will address them at the beginning of each session. We'll see. But I hope you're enjoying Old Moses. See you next time.